Have you ever wondered what the world would be like if certain events in history didn't occur?
We are going to dive in some historical weather events that actually change history. You're watching The Cold Front on VUTV.
And welcome to the Cold Front. We're talking about history and how weather has changed it. And I've always been interested in history. And
Me too. Yeah.
you know, it's such a fun thing to think about. You know, what would happen if, say, a certain president didn't get elected,
Yeah.
or if a tornado was 200 feet a different way, or even a couple miles, or different weather events. We're really gonna go into these things, and there's been cases where what ifs can be played all this episode. And let's start way back in the colonial period with the Pilgrims. The first winter in the Pilgrims, it took a toll on them. In fact, of the 102 original members, there were only 50 who survived the first winter. And a lot of people will wonder, because that winter was not really that harsh. In fact, according to there's obviously no weather history that dates back into the 1600s.
Right.
There was no records taken. However, one was described it back in the winter of 1620 to 21 that it was such a calm winter, such as never seen here before, or seen since, rather, after that. So it was, in fact, there was only one major snow event, one major snowstorm all winter, and yet over half of them died.
Yeah.
So what if this was even a normal winter?
Definitely.
For Plymouth Rock.
Yeah, and especially in the way of like farming, kind of gonna take on the nickname you guys, gave me last year, with resident farm expert. I did grow up on a farm. I do know what it's like, and for a good wheat harvest, a very good frost is actually needed when things are starting to begin to grow. Something called winter wheat, and it thrives in very in colder environments. Obviously, hence the name winter. So if they're having a mild winter, maybe that inhibited some crops being grown, and maybe that, was a part of that. They weren't sure how to get used to farming in this land and all of that. So it could be a lot of different options, especially, with a mild winter, that could have definitely been a factor.
Yeah, and you never know. You're looking at all these events that may or may not have affected them, and they were going through a lot of harsh times, a lot of adversity, and the weather certainly plays a role. It's a new climate for them. They weren't used to the weather systems that we have here in the States. So this whole thing comes on, and every snowstorm is new to them. Every rainy season, it's a different season. Their crops aren't the same. And they had to do a lot of adjusting to that. And what if this winter was harsher, and their crops weren't meant for the harsher winter? That we'll never know that.
Would we have lost more people? Would more people have been prepared?
Or as you hinted at, maybe they would have lost less if it was harsher.
Definitely.
It's so much
really
that we can dive into.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting with things like that, especially, coming to a new world such as the Pilgrims did. But, a little bit later on with the Revolutionary War, actually something that, is obviously a huge deal in American history. It's when, we were fighting for our independence as an independent, country. So it was a pretty big deal. But around sometime in October, I believe around October 16th, was the Battle of Yorktown, and that was in 1781.
So later in the war, near the end.
Yeah, much later in the war. It was definitely near the end, but we all know it was all very important at that time. But Lord Cornwallis from
in the British Army.
Yeah, thank you. The British Army. I was losing my train of thought a little bit, but he wanted to evacuate his trapped army, which was over the York River, which is obviously around the New England area, I believe near New York State, and a thunderstorm kind of blew up. They weren't really expecting it, and so all of their boats got kind of blown off course, blown downstream, and then they were captured by the French. So, if something that thunderstorm wouldn't have happened, or the boats weren't captured or anything like that. Who knows what could have happened.
And this is even
yeah.
before we knew that weather systems moved.
Definitely.
Back in the colonial period and the Revolutionary period, I believe it was even Ben Franklin that discovered that there was a rain event in Philadelphia, and then a couple days later it was in New York, and he was one of the first people to start thinking, well, maybe it's the same system moving.
Definitely.
So in this war, and we're talking about thunderstorms popping up, it absolutely unpredictable, and something that they absolutely couldn't do. And the British were trying to escape on, I believe they called them flatboats. They're much lighter, trying to kind of sneak back across the river. And because of the thunderstorm wind gusts, some of them were blown up to 5 miles off down the river, and the French were pretty much waiting for them. They weren't ready. They were fighting it. They weren't in a fighting mode, and they were captured. Now, if the troops were able to make it up, they were kind of separated. There was more troops up to the north that they were trying to reach. If those two armies could have gotten together, the British would have been very strong.
Yeah, and it would have been very hard for the American troops to overcome them. So
and of course,
it definitely could have been a tipping point in the Revolutionary War at that time. Now, those of us who remember American history and all that, you do know that the Battle of Yorktown was pretty much, the kind of decide-all of the war. That was kind of where the British...
It was the tipping point.
Yeah, that was kind of where the British
if
kind
they
of lost
got together,
their foothold. Yeah.
If they got together, they could have easily taken over.
Yes, they could have.
Because they were separated, the war started to turn in favor of the United States. And, of course, the war would end just 2 years later with the Treaty of Versailles. So, a lot of that is all...
These things you don't really think of. What if...
what
if they would have gotten together?
And the next fight that happened between the British and the United States was the War of 1812.
Yes.
Now, this one was very interesting and even much more of a freak incident than the first thunderstorm back at Yorktown. In the War of 1812, the British had set the White House on fire, and they pretty much had Washington, D.C. captured. And suddenly this rainstorm came, a really heavy downpour rain, which did a couple things. One, it caused the British to kind of retreat, and it helped put the fire out at the White House.
Of course.
And, well, this happened to be a tornadic storm. So there's a tornado in Washington, D.C. And there are reports from British soldiers that cannons were picked up and thrown across the battlefield. So the weather ended up killing a bunch of British troops that, because it wasn't their hometown, they had nowhere to hide. And all this debris was flying, and they were getting hit by the debris of the tornado that came through Washington, D.C. right as they're trying to capture it.
Right.
If that tornado, and we know how random tornadoes are, and even today we can't predict the precise path of a tornado. That tornado, if that doesn't happen, the British might have also taken over the United States then, and history books would have been completely different.
It definitely would have, because it's like you said.
And the White House might not have even been salvageable after that point.
Exactly, that's what I was just about to say, very good point about that. We were talking about we can't, predict the precise path of a tornado. What it would have moved a certain way, it could have taken out the White House, would have looked completely different, today.
And we're talking a matter of miles with that, from helping the British to helping
to helping them, take over, the White House and destroy it and all of that. But, there are actually reports, you talked about reports from the British troops, there are reports from people living in the city as well. They weren't really understanding, why kind of everything was moving, but, it was just, it was kind of incredible to read these reports. And you think about cannons, they're pretty heavy. They have a lot of weight
those
to
things
them.
were a lot of times were moved around by horses, not humans.
Not man.
So they're cast iron. I mean, that's heavy
Very
metal.
heavy.
I mean, for those to be tossed, takes a lot of force.
And that's kind of what I was when you were going through this. It had to have been at least a pretty decent size of a tornado, to be able to pick up those. So
yeah, and they're not talking just moving them; they're talking picking up and being thrown. At least by the perspective of the people in the heat of the battle and the situation. It could obviously be exaggerated through the writings. However, it was that much that it scared and it moved stuff, and a lot of people died. And we're going to keep diving into this history. We're going to go through a little bit further in time, talk about a little bit of politics in weather affecting how even some elections went out. Stay tuned. You're watching The Cold Front on VUTV.
My dad's one of the producers. He's there tonight.
Bring this week.
So, are you going out tonight?
I can't. My parents say I have to be home right after work.
That's so gay.
Totally gay.
Ugh, that is so Emma and Julia.
Why are you saying that's so Emma and Julia?
Well, you know, when something is dumb or stupid, you say that's so Emma and Julia.
Imagine if who you are were used as an insult. When you say that's so gay, do you realize what you say? Knock it off.
I'm Mike Targonsky, and I'm on VUTV.
We're Valpo Greek Life, and we're on VUTV.
We're Bacchus Gamma, and we're on VUTV.
We're the Health Center, and we're on VUTV.
Hi, I'm Pastor Jim, and I'm on VUTV.
We're Hooked on Tonics, and we're on VUTV.
And welcome back to the Cold Front, talking about how weather changed history. And, you know, a lot of things we just mentioned was, you know, how we were able to survive in our early years. Unfortunately, the weather didn't always bring out the best in people. Sometimes it had its hand in some tragedies as well.
It definitely did, and one that, you know, tends to come to mind is the Hindenburg disaster. And the Hindenburg came about during the time, about the time of the Second World War, you know, around the 40s, and it was basically a blimp, you know. That's what the Hindenburg was. The Hindenburg was the name of the ship. And it was leaving from Germany, making its way over to New Jersey. That's where it was going to land. It was a little bit easier way and a little bit cheaper way of travel at that time.
And it was faster than ships. That was the big
thing. It
definitely
definitely was, because airplanes were more used for war at that time.
And there were no big passenger planes,
right,
really.
And especially since this was a little bit more of a time of war, people were a little more hesitant to fly in, you know, big airplanes, things like that. So that's when ships like the, I shouldn't say ships, but airships like the Hindenburg were very popular. And as I mentioned before, this one was coming from Germany to New Jersey. And the interesting thing about it was actually filled with hydrogen. And hydrogen, as we know, is incredibly flammable. And that's kind of what makes this tragedy such, you know, a big deal in history. So kind of what happened was, obviously we know it was filled with hydrogen, and that's incredibly flammable. But also the paint,
Funny thing, the reason why it was filled with hydrogen and not helium, which was typical for balloons at the time, and thing is, Germany didn't have helium, and nobody was willing to sell it to them as part of the war. I don't think the war was quite on yet, but nobody liked Germany. The Allied countries did not want to give Germany helium. Right. So they had to choose another gas that was lighter than air, and they chose hydrogen. So.
And unfortunately for them, you know, they knew it was flammable, but they thought, you know, taking certain preventative measures, like they used a paint, you know, to kind of cover the outside of the craft and the structure of it, but they didn't realize that some of the chemicals included in that paint were also incredibly flammable, and it was just kind of a recipe for a disaster. They didn't quite think it through enough. And so one day when they were on the way, actually getting ready to land in New Jersey, they flew through a thunderstorm cloud. And, you know, the way a thunderstorm cloud works, like a cumulonimbus is what we would call it, you know, there are negative and positive charges in there. And they reacted with the hydrogen. And so it caused, you know, a little bit of a charge and a little bit of a spark. And so when they were getting ready to land in New Jersey, they dropped the rope to kind of anchor the ship down so that everyone was able to get off. That acted as a ground, and it brought that charge, you know, from the ship down to the ground, and that created the spark. And it took seconds for the Hindenburg to be up in flames. Like it was so quick, and like if you watch videos of it, you're just like it happened so quickly.
And
it's almost unreal.
Yeah, it happened extremely fast because of the hydrogen and the paint, but the spark was the charge from the thunderstorm that dispersing when the wires hit the ground.
Definitely.
And so that can obviously affect history. And we're going to shift a little bit of politics now.
Weather and politics.
Back for World War I, slightly before this, Woodrow Wilson was facing re-election. Of course, Wilson was instrumental in his World War II policies. He went to war, but he was kind of the pacifist candidate, trying to keep the peace and bring it towards peace. Now, Wilson was facing Hughes, and obviously California is a huge state to win, but there was a snowstorm in California in the mountains. And for those mountain counties, and obviously California back then, as much as it does now, voted Democratic for Wilson. And there was a lot of those counties that were snowed in, a lot fewer Democratic voters went to the polls. Wilson pulled out California by a mere 2,000 votes.
Wow.
And if that snow was harder, you know, it could have swung towards Hughes, the opposing Republican candidate, which would have caused him to win the presidency. He would have still brought the country to war. He was more of the war candidate. But Wilson was big in the talks, even in the treaty talks. And President Wilson obviously was kind of known as a hero of World War I, bringing America in, helping end the war, and trying to, at the goal, end it. His policies were hugely different than what Hughes would have been.
And it's
it was
like
just 2,000 votes because of a snowstorm.
Like, how much would that have changed history? You know, would we have been in more wars? Would we have been in World War I?
How would have it ended? Yeah, exactly.
And it's one of those things, you know, we don't know how that would have ended. And, you know, kind of keeping on the weather and politics theme, if I could say it properly, a little bit more recent. The first Bush, President Bush Sr., was elected at a time, you know, of Hurricane Andrew, which was back in 1992. And when Andrew went through, it obviously caused a lot of devastation. And one problem that happened with Andrew was FEMA, which is the federal aid for, you know, these emergencies and things like that, didn't get to the victims of Andrew quick enough. So there's a lot of people who were homeless and they were having, you know, problems getting back on their feet. And that was a very big reason, or a lot of people believe is a very big reason, why Bush Sr. was not reelected, because he, you know, couldn't, or people believed he couldn't get the aid down there quick enough to the people.
And they thought he wasn't going to be that effective of a candidate
for another term. Right.
Bill Clinton came to power, and of course Bill Clinton did a lot, a two-term president.
Yes.
You know, he could have been a lot different if Senior would have had one the second term.
Definitely.
Obviously policies would have been much different, as those two, like most current candidates, did not agree at all.
Right, they were quite opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's just some of these things you just never know what could have happened. But that is a big reason why people believe that, you know, he was not reelected. So weather and politics has kind of a funny effect.
And it's
on
amazing
things.
to think that just a snowstorm, a few more inches, maybe those 2,000 people don't go to the polls for Wilson, or if maybe the hurricane made a little different spot, didn't cause as much devastation, and it wouldn't have been that big of an issue for Bush Sr. So, you know, we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we'll keep on this theme, going a little bit more current, and maybe even give you a little bit of a close call from the past from a famous legend in music. Stay tuned. You're watching The Cold Front on VUTV.
Hi everybody, I'm Dick Vitale of ESPN, and I'm on VUTV. It's awesome, baby, with a capital A.
Takeout meals for just $12.99. Call it.
Sherry Pearson. You are the sole surviving heir of the King of Montonopolis, and you are now worth $45 million.
I'm rich. This can't be real.
Of course it's not real. Come on. Having money isn't about luck. Like that takeout meal. Cook at home instead, you can save thousands a year. Feed me.
Feed the pig.
I'm Mitch Dunham, and I'm on VUTV.
Hello, I am Jeremy Kaywood, and I'm on VUTV.
I'm Jonathan Johnson, and I'm on VUTV.
We're Sigma Phi Epsilon, and we're on VUTV.
Hi, I'm Claire Flesh, and I'm on VUTV.
Welcome to my block party. Glad you can make it.
The only triple doubles you get come with fries.
I can do this all day. Your moves are just gay.
Using gay to mean dumb or stupid, not cool.
Not cool.
Not in my house, not anywhere. It's not creative, it's offensive to gay people. And you're better than that.
Danse, balance la cadence, ondule bien tes hanches, au bal du dimanche. Danse, que la fête commence.
You didn't give up on sex, don't give up on birth control either. There are more methods than you think. Find yours at bedsider.org.
And welcome back to the cold front, weather-changing history. And I gotta tell you, the Hindenburg thing, you know, that was just a freak accident from back in the day. And unfortunately, a little recurring theme, maybe on the opposite spectrum, not a thunderstorm this time, but the cold. And this is the Challenger disaster of January 28, 1986. Now, the Space Shuttle Challenger was sitting out waiting. It was delayed a lot, and it was out on the launch pad for a while. And the night before the actual launch, there was a freeze. And down in Florida, I mean,
it's a big
it'll
deal.
happen. It is January, but there was a freeze, and it ended up causing a malfunction in the O-rings, and those are on the rocket boosters, kind of a seal between different sections. Right. And what ended up happening is during liftoff, the heat expanded it out, and there's gaps, some fuel leaked out, and unfortunately when the fuel ran down and made contact with the flames from the jet, the whole thing exploded, and all of the astronauts passed away in that. And because it was so cold, and just that one part that failed, you know, unfortunately the Space Shuttle program was doing a lot of research in the day, and Challenger would have brought a lot, and maybe that didn't really change anything of the future events historically, but obviously a major historical event that was affected by the weather. Space Shuttle programs, obviously.
And it definitely changed, you know, obviously all of these events change people's lives, but it kind of changes the way people, you know, viewed, you know, space travel and, you know, what people kind of sacrifice for science. But something you mentioned with the O-rings is that, you know, with the freeze, it definitely did have an effect on them because, you know, they were so cold, I guess is the only way to put it, and, you know, they were made to expand in the heat, exactly like you said, and because they were so cold, they had been a little bit more brittle, and that also led to part of the malfunction.
And yeah, they failed, and like it wasn't necessarily the fact that it changed our science or revolutionized, but the culture shock that it brought. Just the nation. I was obviously not born. That was a few years before our time, but I mean, my parents will still even talk about where they were on that day. Everyone who was alive then to know what happened knows where they were when they heard the information, much like 9/11 was to us. It's just one of those big historical events that nobody will forget. And maybe let's turn the page from some of the disasters and go into something a little fun.
A little bit, you know, not as sad, so to speak. And so we all know, you know, tornadoes haven't, you know, they affect, you know, pretty much everywhere. I'm pretty sure every state in the United States has had a tornado affect them. But something that's really interesting is back in April of 1936, I believe it was April 5th.
And April, obviously a major player for tornadoes.
It's a transition season.
Back before people knew anything about them.
Definitely, because April is a transition season. That's when we do get a lot of the most violent tornadoes occur in the month of April. But you know, something just kind of interesting about that is, like I said, in April of 1936, a very, you know, bad tornado outbreak happened, but that's not the interesting part. An F5 tornado, which is as large as it gets, actually went through the town of Tupelo, Mississippi. Something very interesting about that is it left just such devastation. I mean, it was completely devastating.
I mean, you've heard this story before. A major tornado hits population, takes out a lot, in this case 200 homes, 48 city blocks. I mean, most of Tupelo was gone, but there is something interesting about one home that wasn't.
Yeah, there's one home, one of a few homes that were not destroyed. And actually that house held a 1-year-old Elvis Presley. So it's definitely really interesting about that storm. Obviously it did cause a lot of devastation. It was very heartbreaking for those people. But Elvis Presley survived, and he went on to make, you know, to be a music icon, you know, music legend. I know I always grew up kind of listening to some of his songs, you know, but it's so interesting to know that, you know, he survived that storm and he went on to continue his successful life.
Correct, and historically, he revolutionized the music industry. And just to think that a major tornado had it shifted 3 or 4 blocks.
Definitely. Could have taken
There's
out his
no
house.
Elvis. There's
Yeah.
no Elvis, you know?
Like,
It's amazing.
songs,
What,
you know?
what would we be listening to now
Right.
if Elvis never happened?
Definitely.
I mean, he's the king.
Yeah,
he really
is.
He really is. So
Yeah.
just this much, and I mean, you can still visit that house today.
Of course.
That could have been completely wiped out
Yeah.
when the big tornado hit
Oh, I
Tupelo,
know.
and that same tornado and system ended up being an F4 in Gainesville,
Yeah,
Georgia,
because
further up the morning. It was a very long-lived tornado.
Definitely.
Lots of damage.
Definitely.
But not enough damage to stop Elvis.
stop
Not even an
yeah,
F5 can stop Elvis.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting when you think about stuff like that, you know? A lot of our music would have impacted, you know? There's so many artists who, you know, looked at Elvis as kind of, you know, an icon and a base for their music. So it's kind of like you said, what would we be listening to, you know? So it's kind of interesting, you know?
And I love thinking about all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's, you know, our music could be different had Elvis, unfortunately, if he would have passed away then, before anyone even knew what could have possibly gone down. Nobody would have been visiting Elvis's grave like they do now.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, so it's literally all that stuff. What would have happened if more of the Pilgrims or all of them were wiped out? You know, what would have happened had the British won either of those wars, the Revolutionary War, 1812, maybe several candidates that didn't go away. Everything would be completely different now. Had even a few weather events not sparked some change, you know.
Yeah.
So that'll wrap up this episode of the Cold Front When Weather Changed History. This was the Cold Front on VUTV.